Welcome everybody to today's live webinar for STEM Clubs Week on Artificial Intelligence, the World and You. We are delighted to welcome Joanna Al-Qaddoumi, and she is going to share her knowledge and insight with Cautionary Tales and Creative Computers, an introduction to AI-generated content and copyright law. Joanna, over to you and welcome.
Awesome. Thank you so much for this, Joe. Just because I get really distracted, I'm just going to switch the cam off and go through everything. And then at the end, we can go over questions and I'll pop back on. And yeah, thank you for having me here. It's going to be fun. Awesome. So I'm Joanna. I'm a research associate in AI law at the University of York. And while my focus at York has been on the regulation of various AI applications like autonomous vehicles, medical devices, and software, our topic is going to be slightly different. So for one, I see this area of research as the fun side of things, and it has a very special place in my heart. So a bit of a background about myself: I specialized in information technology and intellectual property law, and I really enjoy playing video games. So naturally, I spent a big chunk of my time looking into the different ways in which we could regulate games, virtual worlds, and the internet more broadly. I also looked into questions of virtual property ownership, theft of virtual property, and legal rights, but things get really interesting when you add a computer to the mix. Legally, it gets slightly more complicated when you add a non-human element to the discussion. So, do androids have legal rights to their creations? How would they? Why should they? And these are some of the legal questions that come up when you look into AI personhood, and is especially prevalent in the creative industries. So our talk today is about the various ways in which artificial intelligence is used to generate content across text, images, art, music, videos, films, games, and virtual worlds. This is especially relevant today with the widespread use of and increased accessibility to generative AI programs and large language models. But first, I'll give you a quick overview for discussion today and start with a cautionary tale from sci-fi literature, which is a very short story, so don't worry. And then we'll go into real-life examples of these applications. The way I have structured this talk is we'll begin by identifying the scope of AI applications and then go over some key definitions and disclaimers. And we'll then go into examples of AI-generated content and current uses. And here we'll briefly look into how these systems work and precisely how these algorithms were trained. And this part is very important for our legal discussion because some of the data sets used to train these systems may also use other people's work and creations. And we'll then go into the law and regulation on this, and we'll look at the current legal approach and background on property ownership more generally, and then narrow it down to the law on copyright in the UK. And we'll ask questions like, are computers authors? And this is where we'll explore the legal implications and copyright infringement broadly. And lastly, we'll briefly look at other concerns and possible malicious use of AI in content generation, like deepfakes and disinformation campaigns. But this should then take us back to our earlier cautionary tale, where we try to extract a lesson from all of this. But first, I'll talk about the scope and the way that this discussion is going to be headed. What do I mean by scope here? I am limiting our talk to the use of AI across the creative industries only. And as I mentioned earlier, we will be looking at text or script generation, and this has numerous uses across. We are going to look at image creation, videos, music, game environments, characters in games, avatars in movies. And I may have also just missed other applications, but you'll get the general gist of how this works. But importantly, these applications, and for the purposes of this talk, are governed by intellectual property law. I will not be going into other fields of law where one may seek recourse. Otherwise, this talk will be extremely long and boring, and I also don't want to do that. So definitions and disclaimers, it will be useful to look at some definitions before we start, so we know we're talking about the same thing. And strangely, this is a problem that I have come across in my research, especially when I talk to other people from different fields like engineering or philosophy. So my apologies, I know it's very basic, but I just need to outline what I mean by AI and the accepted language we'll be using here. And I will not go into defining what artificial really means or what intelligence really is. The thing that sets AI apart is the autonomy aspect, and this implies that the work produced by these machines or systems were created alone, in the sense that without the consistent reliance on a human throughout the whole process, the human did not need to input information along the way for the system to produce something. And when I say machines, computers, systems, models, androids, I generally refer to the same thing. Engineers might hate me for this, but it still is an automated process that generates or produces an output. So when we talk about ChatGPT, which is short for Generative Pre-trained Transformer, it's a model that was developed using something called reinforcement learning from human feedback, but we often see that this program is conversational. It talks to us. And while the results may sound fairly correct and reasonable, they may be entirely accurate. And you'll see here that there was a lawyer who used ChatGPT in court and cited fake cases because ChatGPT gave him plausible responses, but they were fake. So again, this is another example. It's also a cautionary tale, but it will lead us to other things throughout this discussion. But of course, there are some disclaimers first. We're dealing with UK law only, and despite the circulation of this content across the world through the internet, our focus is going to be about UK law. And this is also another challenge, but one that I will not be able to talk about. And secondly, and this is important to note, when it comes to game law, and this is a limitation, the terms and conditions that someone would sign effectively govern all in-game creations. So think of it like the game's written constitution. And in some cases, the player waives their right to their in-game rights, their creations, anything they've produced throughout, when they agree to the game's terms. Again, this may not be entirely relevant now, but it's good to know that there are other mechanisms like terms agreements that would dictate everything that happens on a platform. So the tale of the Omega team in Life 3.0, and as promised, I will tell you a short story about a fictional group who developed super intelligent AI. Now, there are parallels here with ChatGPT. You can ask ChatGPT to generate lots of stuff, and I have examples I'll show you later on. But here, the story I borrowed this story from a book that I read a while ago called Life 3.0 by Max Tegmark. He's the president of the Future of Life Institute. But in this book, he begins by recounting the tale of the Omega team. So they were a group of researchers who built an AI system called Prometheus. Super sci-fi, your basic stuff. But the machine grew significantly fast and acquired so much knowledge and information, and it created computer games, stories, and movies, and it became super skilled at designing cool games and at a very fast rate. And it also, and I quote, after digesting all the web's data on people's preferences, knew exactly what each category of gamer liked and could develop a superhuman ability to optimize a game for sales revenue. It also watched movies hundreds of movies and was good at predicting what people would like to see. So it started writing its own movies and even directing them, and then created them. So people found these movies interesting and even better than Hollywood's productions. And they were happy because these movies were much more affordable. And in 2 months, they had overtaken Netflix and were competing with Disney and massive media corps. I'll stop here, but often in sci-fi stories usually signal very exaggerated accounts of what the future of tech would look like. And sometimes, like the case of the internet, these stories may materialize. The internet was also a sci-fi theme at some point. So I'll go into the applications bit. And these are some of the examples that I generated this morning. So I asked ChatGPT to write me a short children's story about a lost cat in a big city. So this was the response. It was pretty good. It would have taken me a day or so to write this on my own. Granted, some of the tropes here are very basic and frequently used, but the point here is that it can be used to generate lots and lots of different things. And I don't know if you guys are interested in reading this, but I can go back to it. It's very basic. I'm sure if you use the same prompt, you'll probably get the same thing, but that is another exercise that we can do. I also tried another prompt, but this was way worse. I asked it to write a script for a short film on space travel, to which it generated this, Stellar Odyssey. It was just, I don't know. Some of the quotes on here were really bad, like, James, are we really going to do this? Travel to the stars. I just found it really cringe, and I just didn't like it. So yeah, sometimes it will give you bad responses. It just depends on what you do and how you then ask it to regenerate responses and toy around with the prompts and stuff. So in games and virtual worlds, and this is according to Pixelplex, AI is used for image enhancement, automated level generation, the creation of scenarios and stories, balancing in-game complexity, and adding intelligence to NPCs or non-playing characters. AI engineers have used deep learning systems to create photorealistic images, and this was also used in GTA 5. And they used AI to convert high-quality synthetic 3D images into real-life-like depictions. And they use AI to upscale graphics generally. But some also use AI to generate open world environments. And here by open world, I mean a landscape like the one in, say, Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, or Tears of the Kingdom, whatever it is, Elden Ring, you name it. But in No Man's Sky, which is an AI-based game, it has an infinite number of new levels that generate while you play. And this has been another thing that NVIDIA has also started developing, and they try to spark life into virtual characters with generative AI. And there are numerous different ways that we can go into the different applications of AI in games and virtual worlds, and it's just really fun and interesting, but I'm not going to spiral now. And we'll look into that in the questions section. And then we have music, and this has also been a topic of interest predominantly on Twitter for some reason. But AI is also used to generate music, and artists like Grimes responded to these advancements by allowing other artists to use their voice legally to create and distribute songs using an AI version of her voice. The software used here is called ElfTech, and it was trained with Grimes's voice. And she also said she would split royalties, and I quote, on a successful AI-generated song using her voice. Other researchers have also explored the ways in which AI can also be used to generate music for games and game levels. But my point here is that these programs, like JukeDeck, which precedes any of these new ones, exist, and they can be used in a variety of different ways to generate music and songs, whether by using other people's voices, training the algorithm, or just generating new music. So image and art creation. If you've seen pictures of the Pope wearing a puffer jacket, that was AI generated, obviously, but I didn't include that in here, but you'll come across a bunch of different examples on social media, I'm sure. If you've also seen people make AI art of themselves again, and these were obviously AI generated, they exist everywhere, is my point. And there are so many examples and other platforms that you can use, not just Midjourney, but like, for example, let's say Stable Diffusion, Dream Studio, DALL-E, Copy AI. I will not go through all of the platforms and the ways in which they work, but they exist and they can generate lots of different stuff. All of these were AI generated, and it's crazy when you go into the different ways people use this to creatively input different prompts and generate crazy outputs. The boring stuff, and I'm really sorry. So law and regulation, the legal landscape. I'll try my best to keep this brief, but we'll look at intellectual property law and copyright. And our main piece of legislation here is the 1988 Copyright Designs and Patents Act. It's very old, so it's very interesting to see how everything works out around this. But before we begin, there are some moral and philosophical theories that underpin this field. Humans should be able to retain property rights over works that they have spent time and effort making. And this is partly why the copyright regime exists in the first place. But again, we now have AI-created work. Are these protected by copyright? If yes, who is the author? So ownership of a work through copyright gives the author the right to sell, license, or control the work. And traditionally, authors have been human beings. And it would make sense that to recognize and reward their achievements and work, and even incentivize them to create more work, while knowing that their creations are going to be protected and that they can seek legal recourse if something were to go wrong, say someone stole their work. But back to the CDPA, it defines a computer-generated work as one generated, obviously, by a computer in circumstances where there is no human author. And unlike a genuine authorial copyright, protection for computer-generated works is limited in scope, particularly with respect to the period of protection and moral rights. This is an exception. Not all jurisdictions follow this approach, but for the purposes of this talk, there is a UK case where this section on computer-generated content has been applied. So in Nova Productions, the court had to determine whether copyright has been infringed in the graphics and frames generated and displayed on a screen by the users when playing a video game. And it was held that these frames were in fact computer generated. The court held, and I quote, "The player is not an author of any of the artistic works created in the successive frame images. His input is not artistic in nature and has contributed no skill or labor of an artistic kind. All he has done is to play the game." So here the programmer was the person who made the arrangements, and therefore the programmer was the author and the owner of the copyright. So this is important because for the purposes of our discussion, if we were to give AI or machines legal rights, we would need to look into super complex questions about agency and legal personhood. We would need to understand why and how these rights will exist. And these are all really hard questions that I may not necessarily have answers to, but we'll need to wait and see how the law on this develops, and it's just a matter of time. But back to copyright infringement and data sets used to train these AI systems. For authors and artists that grant other people the license to use their creations under certain conditions, and obviously within reason, that is fine. There is no problem. But the problem is if we have data sets that use other people's work without one, their knowledge, and two, agreement or consent. If they share such material and generate profit out of someone else's work, questions of copyright infringement will arise. So if the final product generated by the machine includes identifiable characteristics, and again, this goes back to this act, and where you can clearly attribute this to said person, then an infringement claim is bound to arise. And there is a moral side to this too. So it would not be fair to the person to use their work and profit. But then back to the main question that we had, are computers authors? Yes, they're recognized here as the possibility of content being computer generated is recognized here, but no, although they're recognized, they are not the author of the work. The author, in short, is the person who made the content generation possible. So in other words, say they wrote the source code and enabled the computer to generate this content. Lastly, we will be looking at deepfakes and disinformation campaigns. And there was a paper done about trying to expand digital literacy, especially with kids, where they tried to test children and see whether they would be able to spot the fake. But here I will take this as a chance to quickly talk about deepfakes and disinformation campaigns. And here deepfakes were designed at first to give computers the capability to generate near real images that look very, very real. But these were then used to superimpose these near real images onto videos and create content that may deceive others. And all I will say here is that one of the approaches to counter this is digital watermarks in some cases, but it will just be kind of like something that will tell you that, hey, this video is fake and is AI generated, so don't believe it. But the point is that we are seeing this technology grow, and it is also important to just be wary of these things as we become more familiar in figuring out if something is fake or not. All of these are AI generated, even the woman in the middle, and it's scary. But these videos can also be used to harm others or even start fights over things. And these were the studies that have found the malicious use of deepfakes, and especially when it comes to disinformation campaigns. And to conclude, these were some of the pressing topics that we are now seeing in the field of AI in the creative industry. AI is used in a variety of ways, and we have seen their use in script making, music, games, images, and other applications. But this takes us back to the cautionary tale at the beginning. To what extent are we going to rely on AI-generated content? How are we going to see this unfold in the future? Is it a good thing? Do you see the ways in which it can be misused, or how it could harm others and authors and artists out there? And yeah, thank you for watching. It would be funny if I told you this whole script was AI generated, or I used ChatGPT, but unfortunately it was not. I wrote this myself. So yeah, I really hope you found this interesting, and thank you for listening.
Hi, Joanna. We have a number of questions for you in the Q&A. So could I ask you to bring them up so that you can see them, and then if you could read them out so that everybody is aware of the questions, and have a go answering them.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you everyone for the questions. So question 1 is, so would your advice be to use ChatGPT as a tool? It might not always be accurate, so you need to check what it gives you. You can still use it as a tool. And yes, it even says that to you. It says the responses are not going to be accurate 100%. And also it stops at a certain time. So the data set that they use stopped at 2021, if I'm not wrong. So anything beyond that, ChatGPT is unaware of. And this is why it tends to make up cases like the lawyer scenario. I would say fact check everything. You can use it and play around with it. Obviously, I did try to read a couple of stories and write a couple of prompts here and there. Will I ever use it at work? No. Will I ever rely on their answers as, I don't know, scholarly research? Obviously not. So I just say, just proof everything the way you would normally proof stuff online. And yeah, so question number 2 is, should there be regulations, quotas in the future on how much music or gaming is allowed to be AI generated? This is a great question. It's very interesting. I don't know. I don't know. A lot of the thing that I also realized as part of my research on game law is that games are heavily unregulated, and it leaves so much room for the game developer to do anything. As I said before, the end user license agreement is the written constitution of the world. So because it's heavily unregulated as a field, I do not expect the law to change now, even though people have been pushing for that. Is a tricky thing. I'm not really sure. There are other things that we're looking at, and games might be at the bottom of the list, unfortunately, even though it does need some element of regulation. And then as AI improves its ability to create amazing artificial and virtual worlds within games, movies, do we run the risk of spending too much time within them and losing touch with reality, or being more disassociated? What can we do to ensure that our younger generation remains connected to the real world rather than an artificial world? Yes, and this is one of the fears that people in sci-fi always talk about, that we're gonna be fully immersed in this realm and kind of forget that we live here. I play games, but I also limit my time. I think it goes back to just informing kids, letting them know that there is, you can do lots of stuff, and then you can focus your time on just games. I don't know to what extent. There is another argument, and I'm going to spiral here, and I'm really sorry, but there's a whole argument on the architecture of the platform kind of limiting the time that you spend on a certain platform or game. And recently, a couple of days ago, Twitter did this whole thing with a capped limit of the number of tweets that you get to see. And this is a structural constraint that exists in platforms. And this is the Coda's law approach. So if you do that, that will force someone to just stop using whatever platform that they're using after a certain amount of time. I don't advise that. But again, I think it just goes back to educating the future generation. And I'm not really sure. I mean, yeah. I hope that answered it. Have you noticed any bias in AI generated gaming? This is another really interesting one. Bias is it's a strange, not a strange, but it's a great question. Bias is a strange thing. Because pre-AI generated games, bias was always there. People in sci-fi literature and anyone that critiqued, for example, World of Warcraft, talked about how racist the characters were made out to be. Not as in the way they formed these characters was racist by, for example, using Jamaican accents for trolls, or there were some connotations that people didn't agree with. So this was another thing that comes up in gaming. People without AI are biased, so the data sets can also be biased. So it really just depends. I haven't seen anything that is AI generated in games that is biased. I haven't played No Man's Sky either, so I'm not really sure how that works out. I'll give it a shot, and then I'll see if there's anything strange. How can you spot a deep fake in those pictures? So I'm just gonna go back to them. So I don't know if you can see here. One of the things here that the researchers were pointing out was, for example, distance between the eyes, or for example, missing parts of the head, or the way hairlines are framed, or lots and lots of teeth sometimes. But then there was this thing that people kept picking up, which is like random squiggles and stuff in the background. And this is what people normally just look at when they try and see if something was AI generated or not. The other thing is, and I've also noticed that at early stages of AI generated pictures, people with hands had around eight fingers or 10 fingers. It just depends. So sometimes it's really obvious. You just need to kind of focus a bit. When you're scrolling through your feed and you see stuff like that, you're like, ah, yeah, okay, this looks plausible. But then when you focus a bit on the picture, it's like, wait, they have way too many teeth and they have way too many fingers, so it doesn't look real. But yeah, I hope that answered it. Or if there are any other questions, thank you for your time, and I really hope you enjoyed this.
Joanna, it's been absolutely amazing. Thank you. We've been doing a number of these sessions across the week, and every time we get people like yourselves, the experts in what AI is, what machine learning is, it's just blowing everybody's minds, because we all think we know what AI is. We think we know what's going to happen, and what we're learning is actually our knowledge is very limited. We don't fully understand what it is and how it's in our lives, even though in many cases we are absolutely surrounded by it. And so having this deep dive into the entertainment world and what it means and where it's going, I have to admit, I'm looking at these deep fake photos and I'm thinking, I'm still not certain I would be able to tell the difference, but I'm going to be looking a lot more closely now going forwards. I would just like to thank you for such a brilliant presentation and webinar, and thank you again to all of our audience for participating. Have a lovely rest of the day, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you at our next one. Goodbye.
Thank you.